Hello, all, and on behalf of Making World's bookstore in Philadelphia, a city built on Lenape lands, and Common Notions Press, we would like to welcome you to Arts of Rebellion in the Fourth World War. I'd like to start by thanking our co-sponsors, the Global South Center. This event is part of the Radical May, month-long festival of events that Common Notions Press and other publishers in the Radical Publishers Alliance and Literal have put together to transform the world. Plenty of amazing events to check out, and so we'll drop a link in the chat so you can find out more about what else is in store for the rest of the month. We are delighted to have the opportunity to hear from Jennifer Ponce de León and take the occasion to help launch her recent book, Another Aesthetics is Possible, Arts of Rebellion in the Fourth World War. We're equally delighted to have Macarena Gómez-Barris of the Global South Center with us today to join the conversation, and I'm delighted to introduce them more fully in just a moment. Jennifer's book carefully explores the related histories of social struggles in the Americas and the power of aesthetics to both compose and make visible a world beyond capitalism. The book that is taking center stage in the discussion today, Another Aesthetics is Possible, is available from Making World's bookstore at the link in the chats. You can visit us at our bookshop page, also linked in the chat, and our websites. I also want to mention two related Common Notions books that accompany today's events. The first is Grupo de Arte Caballero's Thought, Practices, and Actions, which offers a profound look into the social militancy and art of the feminist art collective's work in Argentina over the last 2 decades. Not at all a nostalgic review looking backwards, however, Thought, Practices, and Actions raises the indispensable question of what was done to combat, joyously and collectively, those early days of neoliberalism's despair, and what remains to be done to make another aesthetics and another revolution possible. And if you're inspired by what you hear and read today, please be on the lookout for our forthcoming new edition of 19 and 20 Notes for a New Insurrection, which tells the story of the 2001 rebellion in Argentina, one of the most popular uprisings against neoliberalism, and one whose history is crucial for navigating our present. And these are also available at Making World's bookstore and directly from Common Notions. Your support for collective, nonprofit, independent bookstore and publishing houses is greatly appreciated and politically, culturally, and economically vital to our work. You can also join our monthly sustainers program for both Common Notions and Making Worlds for as little as $5 a month or more. So with that, I'd like to offer brief introductions of our two speakers before we get started today. Jennifer Ponce de León is Assistant Professor of English and Faculty in Latin American and Latinx Studies at the University of Pennsylvania and Associate Director of the Critical Theory Workshop. She's the author of Another Aesthetics is Possible, Arts of Rebellion in the Fourth World War, which we are launching today. And later she'll be in conversation and joined by Macarena Gómez-Barris, who's founding director of the Global South Center and chair of the Department of Social Science and Cultural Studies at Pratt Institute. Maca is also the author of The Extractive Zone, Social Ecologies and Decolonial Perspectives, Where Memory Dwells, Culture and State Violence in Chile, and co-editor of Toward a Sociology of the Trace. Now, I'm delighted to invite Jennifer up on the screen to take things away and give us more than an exciting glimpse into the writing and the thinking behind Another Aesthetics is Possible. So welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you very much, Mala, for organizing this. I just want to also thank Making Worlds, Bookstore and Social Center, Common Notions Press, the Global South Center at Pratt, and the Radical May Festival. And I'm really thrilled that Macarena Gómez-Barris is here as well. And I'm very grateful to her for joining us. So this book, Another Aesthetics is Possible, grew out of research questions that I've pursued for about 20 years. Most broadly, those are questions about the role of cultural productions, the arts, and professional intellectuals in class struggles, and more specifically, our role in struggles of the popular classes towards emancipatory or egalitarian ends. Related to this are questions about how to analyze the politics of aesthetics, and how to analyze artistic practices whose social lives are bound up with political struggles. To outline how my book addresses these questions, I'll start by explaining its title. On one hand, Another Aesthetics refers to my approach to conceptualizing aesthetics. I critique the ideology of art's autonomy from the social world, as well as the idea that the aesthetic is a realm of experience or judgment that can be separated from the rest of social life. I also reject the idea that the analysis of aesthetic qualities should confine itself to those practices and productions that are defined as art, fine art, or literature, as this amounts to naturalizing bourgeois and colonial notions of art and the aesthetic and their attendant hierarchies of cultural value. While my book focuses on practices by artists, I argue that these should be understood as they participate in cultural and ideological struggles that are ranged across the social landscape and that have rich aesthetic dimensions. Negating essentialist or transcendent conceptualizations of art and the aesthetic was also necessary because the works that I examine in this book are not always or only understood by others to be art. They have, for example, been seen as vandalism, activism, commerce, or popular gaming. And I address the contingent identification of something as being art or not, as it overdetermines the interpretation of the thing in question, and as something that artists knowingly manipulate for specific purposes. In my book, I treat aesthetics as an essential component of ideology, and also as a framework for thinking of ideology as a compositional process. I elaborate on this in greater detail in an article I wrote with Gabriel Rockel titled Toward a Compositional Model of Ideology, on which I wrote after finishing the book. I understand ideology in the Marxist sense as a consciousness of the world and self that is produced and transformed through material practices, and that includes perceptions, habits, values, and desires in addition to representations. Ideology actively shapes human cognition and perception by forging collective worlds of sense that make sense. And by make sense, I mean provide for a practical consciousness that is often incoherent and contradictory. This is what Gramsci refers to as common sense when he talks about how we are products of the historical process that has deposited in us an infinity of traces without leaving an inventory. He juxtaposes this to the need for developing good sense as a critical consciousness and a coherent understanding of social reality and the forces affecting its development. My book examines artworks that cultivate and promote that kind of good sense. And I argue that their ability to do this does not simply derive from the artists who made these works, but from the knowledge that has been collectively produced through the praxis of social movements and collective struggles with which these artists have various types of connections. Thus, the assertion that another aesthetics is possible, which is a citation of the Zapatistas' assertion that another world is possible, is based on my argument that because aesthetic practices and productions shape how we perceive and understand the world, they can and do participate in the multidimensional and collective labor of creating and defending another social reality. In my book, I examine artists and experimental art practices that have been linked to, respectively, the grassroots human rights movement in Argentina, the anti-globalization movement, opposition to the US-led wars in the Middle East, and anti-displacement struggles in LA, as well as to Zapatismo. I focused my interests in the politics of art around the relationship specific art practices have to movements for several reasons. First, this appealed to me as a materially grounded way of analyzing the ways political agency is exercised via cultural expression, without suggesting that art or culture alone are sufficient to bring about meaningful social change. Secondly, I wanted to demonstrate how movements have influenced contemporary experimental artistic practice, as well as show how artists and writers have contributed to movements with their art. Thirdly, because artistic practices articulated with movements contribute to these movements' archives and repertoires, analyzing them also offers insight into the history of particular movements, ideological tensions within them, and their as yet unrealized potentials. My interest in how art practice has been and can be conjoined with political struggles first emerged from research I did over the course of many years, beginning around 2001, on the arts of the Chicano movement and the impact this movement had on subsequent Chicanese cultural production. The Chicano liberation movement was a social movement that emerged in the US Southwest in the 1960s to combat the racist exploitation and political and cultural domination of working class Mexican Americans. My research on it gave me an appreciation for the ways that art can contribute to movement praxis, as well as for the many ways that movements produce and disseminate counter-hegemonic ideologies and novel perceptual configurations. This research also gave me an appreciation for the importance of the ideological struggles that go on within any movement. In the course of my research, I became frustrated with certain tendencies in the historicization of the Chicano movement and its art, wherein the grammar of racialized liberal pluralism, which is so foundational to contemporary US political culture, overwrites the movement's complex ideological field, and wherein cultural identity is treated as the privileged site for analyzing the politics of Chicanx or Latinx expressive culture. This led me to reflect on the political stakes of how movements and their cultural expressions are historicized. It also prompted me to expand the scope of my research beyond the US, so I could situate Chicanx history and culture within a transnational framework of analysis, and also so I could learn from intellectual and activist communities in the Global South and from intellectual traditions that are often marginalized within the US Academy. I had initially planned to investigate how arts of protest created in the 70s and 80s in the Southern Cone in the context of right-wing US-backed dictatorships could be put into conversation with contemporaneous works in the US that were protesting the US police state and its imperialist machinations. But when I first started my research in Chile and Argentina in 2005, I became engrossed instead in a history that was still unfolding around me, that of a more recent wave of popular movements and their allied artistic expressions. These are movements that have contested the particularly savage form of capitalism that we refer to as neoliberalism, and which have brought about crises of legitimacy for neoliberal states across the hemisphere. I wanted to know why and how these movements emerged, what is at stake in them, and how artists have responded to and contributed to them. My research in life later took me to Brazil, Mexico, and then back to Southern California, where I worked in the nonprofits arts sector as a researcher and independent curator. When it came time to organize all of my research into a book, I chose a selection of movements and artists that would be its focus. And I want to note that there are others that I wanted to write on, but couldn't do so because of constraints of time and word count. So I've written about some of these other projects since I finished this book. In writing Another Aesthetics is Possible, I faced the challenge of explaining what a constellation of local histories, cited respectively in LA, Buenos Aires, Chiapas, and Tijuana, have to do with each other. To do this, I needed to situate them within a broader cartography of contemporary class struggles in the Americas. So I historicize each of the movements and local social struggles I examine within the context of the Fourth World War. This is the name the Zapatistas have given to class warfare since the 1990s, since neoliberal capitalism has become globally hegemonic. As, to quote William Robinson, capitalist classes have managed to go further than ever before in tearing down all non-market structures that have in the past placed limits on the accumulation and the dictatorship of capital. By historicizing different movements and art practices as they emerge from and respond to class warfare as it unfolds across multiple geographic scales, this has allowed me to show that these are connected histories. That, for example, the dispossession of Mexican peasants that resulted from neoliberal counter-reforms and imperialist trade agreements is related to the immiseration of Argentine workers through the application of IMF dictates, as well as to the illegalization of immigrants in the US and to the often racist criminalization of working class people in LA as well as in Buenos Aires. It makes perfect sense that these are connected histories, not only because the capitalist world system is precisely that, but also because I'm writing about a historical phase in which class relations have been thoroughly transnationalized. And I'm writing about places that have developed within the same overlapping imperial orbits. But it was also important for me to demonstrate that these are connected histories, to argue that we should see these contemporary movements, uprisings, and their allied artistic practices as forming part of a transnational anti-systemic tendency that is rooted in global class struggle. I wanted to do this because so often dominant representations of contemporary popular movements and uprisings make them seem like local and temporary interruptions of business as usual, or as footnotes to liberal progress narratives. So my book offers a study of the work of a half dozen artists and art collectives whose corpus includes poetry, street theater, video, guerrilla urban interventions, manifestos, transmedial narratives, and an alternate reality game. These works draw on a rich repository of techniques and forms, some from the arts and some from other practices as well. Contrary to what one often hears about leftist art being didactic or simplistic in its messaging, I argue that there is in fact an enormous drive, indeed a necessity for experimentation in leftist art, because art that seeks to affect how people understand social reality must be as dynamic as that reality. This includes formal experimentation, and the utilization of techniques that are considered extraneous to codified notions of fine art. And this experimentation also includes the creation of alternative means of producing and circulating art and literature that alters the social relations this typically involves. On another level, I used an analysis of these artists' work to make a series of arguments about a set of ideological struggles that are particularly salient in the historical conjunctures and contexts I examine. So I'm going to highlight these as I talk a bit about each chapter. Chapter 1 is concerned most broadly with the ways in which colonial and neocolonial practices are endemic to contemporary modes of capitalist accumulation in the Americas, and that they are actively pursued and legitimated by liberal states and their ideological apparatuses, including museums. It demonstrates how these practices are normalized via the composition of bourgeois colonial worldviews, which include deeply felt moral convictions, and that in fact require both the systemic effacement of history as well as essentially racist conceptions of human collectivities in order to make sense. And here I mean common sense in Gramsci's usage. I demonstrate this through my analysis of anti-colonial texts, artworks, and political actions. The Zapatistas, or the EZLN, a rebel army and political force led by indigenous peasants in Chiapas, serves as a privileged example of contemporary anti-colonial and anti-capitalist praxis and theorizing. Most of this chapter is dedicated to the analysis of work by Fran Eilich, a Mexican writer and multimedia artist who has long been engaged through his art and activism with the broader social movement that is constellated around the EZLN. It focuses in particular on Eilich's heterodox alternate reality game, Raiders of the Lost Crown, in which the game's players plot to recapture a legendary Mexica or Aztec headdress from the Austrian Ethnology Museum that owns it. And you can go ahead and put up the first slide. This work, there were many aspects to this work, and one of them, Eilich appropriated the copyright image of this headdress that is, actually, I should make sure that this is, make sure that the slides are going. In one of these, the artist appropriated the copyrighted image of the headdress that is owned by Vienna's World Museum. And on the back, it had the logo of the museum as well as that of the Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, which owns a facsimile of the headdress and has been advocating for its return of the original. So the inclusion of these logos gave the impression that this souvenir, this looks like a souvenir postcard, was actually produced by these institutions, which caused enormous consternation among the organizers of the festival that commissioned Eilich's work. Now this work's implicit invocation of the Nazi Holocaust throws light on the very different ways in which genocides have been historicized and regarded by states and in international law. In this way, it recalls Aimé Césaire's assertion that representations of Nazism as an exceptional barbarism exemplify racist pseudo-humanism in their implicit disavowal of the violence Europeans unleashed on those they colonized. As Raiders unfolded through epistolary and financial exchanges, guerrilla interventions at the museum, an online petition, and the operations of a pop-up coffee shop, the mission to repatriate the headdress was revealed to be a plot device within an interactive narrative about colonial ideologies and regimes of debt and property, and which included a pointed critique of Mexican nationalist ideologies and the ways they marshal signifiers of indigeneity. In keeping with my interest in the way that the politics of any given work also relates to the relations its production, distribution, and reception entail, I also discuss how Eilich linked the production of this work to a solidarity market for Zapatista coffee, so that funds used to commission the work went to materially support Zapatista communities. This chapter shows how representations put forth by anti-colonial intellectuals and activists rectify colonial common sense, not just by critiquing it, but by offering an alternate worldview that is equally comprehensive, insofar as it addresses morality, history, how we conceptualize the economy, and so on. In fact, this worldview is more comprehensive because it actually accounts for the social totality, including the colonial undergirding of the global economy, as well as histories that are expunged from or whitewashed in colonial progress narratives. I show how Eilich's transmedial narrative art effectively juxtaposes bourgeois common sense and the critical good sense produced from anti-colonial praxis to demonstrate that these are competing worlds of sense-making. For example, in Raiders, a proposal to the players that they waive rent payments owed by the Austrian Museum for its commercial use of a looted headdress becomes both an ironic allegory about the colonial character of capitalist debt and property regimes, and a proposal for a true anti-imperialist accounting of accumulation at a global scale. You can go ahead and move forward in the slides to go ahead and a few more to the Pocho Research Society. One more. The second chapter addresses the geographic displacement of working class Latinos and Latin Americans as a consequence of class struggles that implicate the production, occupation, and control of space. It focuses on guerrilla memorials the Pocho Research Society of Erased and Invisible History installed around Los Angeles in the 2000s. This society was founded and led by Sandra de la Loza, and her collaborators included many Latinx writers in LA. I situate the Research Society's work within a recent history of gentrification in LA and grassroots resistance to the criminalization and displacement of primarily Black and brown proletarians. Their site-specific memorials about activist, cultural, and nightlife spaces that have been shuttered due to gentrification demonstrate both the crucial use value of space for sustaining sexual, political, and artistic communities, and the effects of profit-driven urban development for disorganizing and marginalizing these communities. I argue that the Research Society's work is able to show this because of its counter-hegemonic approach to producing public history. That is, because of the way the Research Society reconceptualizes both the practice of historical production and the object of the past with which it is concerned, their work is able to bring into view social agents, conflicts, and historical forces that are regularly expunged from dominant histories about LA. Indeed, works that juxtapose official historical markers with the Research Society's unofficial guerrilla histories of the same sites juxtapose different epistemological and practical frameworks for historical production. They also juxtapose radically different ways of perceiving specific places. And you can see this in the image. The official plaque is the large bronze plaque above with a pair of plaques, and the Research Society's guerrilla historical plaque is positioned beneath, almost like a footnote. But it's a footnote that actually recasts the entire, the official memorial itself. So in this example, the significance of a site that is officially memorialized in a very nationalist narrative about LA's colonial settlement is recast via the Research Society's work. So instead, this site is made to be seen within a transnational history of Mexican and Central American migration, transnational solidarity work, and US imperialism. So this chapter demonstrates that historical representations are a key ideological terrain for social conflicts over the occupation and control of space. And we see this in myriad forms. from the work of nationalist memorials in naturalizing territorial conquest, to the ways projects of urban development and so-called urban revitalization marshal historical discourses that efface the class and often racist character of such projects. I also argue that the Research Society's work be understood as a contestation of anti-immigrant racism directed against Mexicans and Central Americans, as it contests the nationalist socio-spatial imaginaries that serve to naturalize borders and the international division of labor, as well as to hide the role of US imperialism in forcing Latin American people to migrate. Finally, I want to note that I also saw this chapter as an opportunity to write about Chicanx art practices via an anti-identitarian mode of analysis that is nonetheless attentive to the social positioning of the artists and their subjects within racialized class relations and political structures. You can move on to the next slide. The book's final two chapters are based on research I did in Buenos Aires over the course of several years, focusing on movement-based art practices from the late 1990s and 2000s. In this period of time, which was marked by an economic depression, a major financial crisis, and popular urban movements mobilized on a massive scale in resistance to the engineered immiseration of the working class, and a popular uprising ousted Argentina's president and cabinet. This is a photo from a performance that was created shortly after this uprising, in which the artists of Etc. convened a protest performance in which people threw their own shit onto the National Congress building. Etc. is one of the two groups I focus on in this chapter who have been using their art as a tool of movement-based militancy since the 1990s. Grupo de Arte Callejero, whose name means street art group and who's known as GAC, is the other group, which Malav also mentioned. Both GAC and Etc. have used their art to contribute to the grassroots human rights movement in Buenos Aires. This movement has been the principal force for demanding justice for state terrorism and political genocide that was committed by a right-wing military regime and its civilian allies during the country's most recent dictatorship, which ended in 1983. I historicized the global liberal human rights regime that came to prominence in the 1970s as functioning in certain ways as a counter-revolutionary force, insofar as it promotes a defensive politics of individual rights and effaces histories of anti-capitalist struggle. By doing this, I show how Argentina's grassroots human rights movement is a site of intense ideological struggle in which these artists actively engage through their art. Next slide. For example, one more slide. GAC's guerrilla interventions in public space mimic street signage and tourist maps, but they actually serve to orient their viewers to material histories that contest official ideologies of national reconciliation that were promoted in the wake of the dictatorship. This includes signage that identifies the homes and crimes of accomplices in state terrorism, and that function in denunciation protests, known as escraches, that are organized by the human rights movement. In this image, you can see the members of GAC installing one of these signs that indicates precisely where somebody, an author of state terrorism, lives. And these function in these protests to help direct people to the home where there's a massive kind of collective denunciation that serves to create a social condemnation of the authors of state terrorism. Next slide. This is another image of GACs that mimics a kind of touristic signage, but it's actually identifying the site of a former clandestine torture center. Next slide. And here is one of several maps that GAC would create and update annually that documents all of the sites of and includes the addresses of the homes of people who have been denounced by the human rights movement for their complicity in state terrorism. And so it kind of reiterates in visual form the denunciation. One more slide. So this is from one of Etcetera's works. Etcetera created allegorical performances both within escraches, these denunciation protests, and as escraches. But they used these performances as an opportunity to advance anti-nationalist and anti-capitalist analyses of Argentina's recent political history. This is an image from a performance that also functioned as an escrache and that was staged in front of Argentina's National Museum of Fine Arts. Rather than denounce military officers, which are often the objects of denunciation, this work focused its condemnation on a very powerful arts patron and trustee of the Museum of Fine Arts, named Nelly Blaquier. She is the principal shareholder of the Ledesma Corporation, whose president, who is Blaquier's ex-husband, is accused of complicity in the forced disappearance of employees of this corporation during the dictatorship. But Etcétera's performance also connected this history of using state-led terrorism as a form of labor discipline to this corporation's ongoing role in the destruction of proletarian lives and the biosphere through its poisonous emissions. So I show how GAC and Etcétera contribute to and utilize tactics and discourses developed by the human rights movement, and how in doing this, they push human rights discourse towards a more comprehensive accounting of state violence, as well as the violence of capital as seen as in the destruction of proletarian lives and the environment. Now, in the fourth chapter, I show how struggles within the human rights movement are sharpened in what is kind of cynically referred to as the period of normalization following Argentina's popular uprising, in which state hegemony was reestablished under the populist government of Nestor Kirchner, who promoted a return to normal capitalism. When Kirchner's government took up the discourse of the human rights movement as its own, many activists aligned themselves with these efforts. However, the artists of Etcétera criticized this alignment and satirized a solemn state ceremony about the memory of dictatorship, critiquing it as a whitewashing of the routine violence of the bourgeois liberal state. I think one of the next slides should have an image of this. Another one, I think. There we go. So this is one of a series of performances, urban and media interventions and videos by GAC and Etcétera that interrogated the two sides of so-called normalization. On one hand, the repression of working class movements and communities under the sign of security, and on the other hand, the casting of bourgeois electoral politics and politicians as the saviors of the Argentine people via various forms of political theater. In this chapter, I also address Etcétera's creation of the Internacional Errorista, which is a kind of surrealist send-up of an armed guerrilla, which they created as a response to the proliferation of counterterrorism discourses and laws in the Americas after 2001. I think in one of the next slides, you can see some images of the Erroristas. There you go. The Erroristas' appearance at protests against the free trade area of the Americas and against the US-led wars in Iraq and Afghanistan provoked spontaneous social performances that lay bare the functions of policing for maintaining social stratification and a fear-induced fidelity to the state. Moreover, the videos created from these performances help us to see how the criminalization of working class movements in Argentina is in fact an expression of transnational capital's class warfare, which is enforced by the US state and international financial institutions. So in closing, I just want to mention two projects that I'm working on since I finished Another Aesthetics is Possible, because they delve more fully into questions that this first book, I think, kind of begins to theorize. I'm writing a book with Gabriel Rockhill titled Revolutionizing Aesthetics, Composing a World Beyond Art, that offers a Marxist theoretical framework for understanding ideology as an aesthetic phenomenon and for provincializing bourgeois conceptions of art in the analysis of aesthetics. And this book also analyzes the social relations of cultural production as it both overdetermines artistic creations, while also showing how those relations have been the target of intervention by leftist artists, ranging from Brecht to Teatro Campesino to Cine de Liberación and Cine de la Base. And my next project that I'm also working on, which is provisionally entitled Envisioning Internationalism, picks up on my interest in the material connections between local anti-systemic struggles in Latin America and the US. In Another Aesthetics is Possible, many of these connections are surfaced via my historicization of local movements. But this next book is looking at the ways that artists and writers explicitly articulate a vision of proletarian internationalism as a necessary politics for the 21st century. So I'll close with that. Thank you very much. I think Maka will join us. Wonderful.
So thank you so much for that, Jennifer. That was wonderful. And I really want to thank Malav and Common Notions Books as well. And I'm also grateful to you, Jennifer, for inviting me today to be in conversation with you and for producing this powerful, timely, beautifully researched, and conceptually profound work on the arts of rebellion in the Fourth World War, Another Aesthetics is Possible. It was great to hear you talk about this book, and I am thoroughly convinced it is one of the books that we need to be reading right now. It's a book that offers crucial connections between what in the US is sometimes theorized as separate realms of the arts and politics. And there's a reason for this that you point to throughout the book, but you don't actually make explicit, which I think is really lovely how you kind of thread it through. Namely, you point to the underlying social relations of production that is our capitalist present within a paradigm of war. And there I'm using Nelson Maldonado Torres's term. This is a war, as you carefully theorize and elucidate, against the immiserated, the dispossessed, against Black, Brown, Indigenous migrants, a war that is global, and it is waged through land grabs and new enclosures, and also through the tightening of the global capitalist machinery. Yet the rebellion against this fourth war is not merely fought in the material realm, but it's also fought there. It's also waged in the sphere of perception, as you just outlined so beautifully in your introduction of the book. It's in the sensorium, it's through ideology, and it's in the ongoing practice of artful, collective, and vernacular popular resistance. The Uruguayan writer, Eduardo Galeano, as you offer, gives us actually a potent metaphor for the inverted relations of production that we currently live in, where education is colonial, where value is thingified, and relationships are mediated by the toxifying condition of capital. So to look in this looking glass mirror is to give us back a distorted view, one that's returned to us as the pedagogies that would have us suffer the existing organization of the global capitalist order, rather than reaching for that other world, that potential otherwise, that other order, perhaps more just, more horizontal, maybe even more socialist. Ponce de León, you, like Galeano, I think ask us to pause and to reflect and to critique and to reorganize our worldview according to the roots of the ground visions and practices of critical mediators. That's, I think, one way to think about these various artistic, approaches, these artists, these writers. And these critical mediators are part of what you term a radical cultural left in and of the Americas. So I would extend this and pose it as a question that I think you actually answer for us in the book. Are there ways, or what are the ways, that this left creates a Marxism that is fearless about its own reinvention? So you point to the experimentality there. Sorry about that. And that becomes very, very important for us. These artists, makers, writers, and performers that you engage in this book are not merely subjects or producers of work that you study. I think what's brilliant is the way in which you talk about a long arc of in-depth work, of interview, of participatory research, that's maybe decolonial in its range, that's about 15 or 20 years of a relationship with artists. It's unusual sometimes to see that, that depth of work. Further, as a hemispheric group of critical cultural producers, these artists actually ridicule the idea of the individual as an elevated artist, as part of a star chamber, as the genius creator who's making it within a capitalist art world, often represents the pinnacle achievement of an extractive art market. Instead, each of these artists and art collectives and performers and poets and writers that you discuss embody their labor and their multiple capacities and their talents and their criticalities and engage in collective struggle, such as communalism within communities, even creating those communities and tethering them as ways to transform actually the disturbed relations of production and the violence of the underlying structures of vertical power. This radical participation is about an anti-racist, as you mentioned, an anti-colonial, a socially engaged political and cultural production, creation of multiple sensoriums. So how do these art practices do this? As you showed us now, and as the book really delves into, they do this by prodding us, by shitting upon things, literally in the case of El Mierdazo in Argentina, by stretching imaginations, by ingesting, by refusing, by protesting, by researching. They escrache, or they scratch up or write in their disappeared and detained. They dismantle authoritarian power. They defy border militarization and the kind of policing practices of their communities. And they differently invest value, and that's very key to your work, the different investment in value within our critical imagination. So they imagine outside of the authoritarian system that liberally authors, or they disrupt the normativity of the draconian squeeze that liberally despairs. Through your critical interpretations, and especially in chapter 1, there's just such a rich meeting of the artist. Here we meet Fran Eilich, who makes new currencies. And I think this is fascinating and so important at this moment. These are new currencies that are not an aestheticization of politics, as John Beller has recently argued in the case of NFTs or non-fungible tokens, right? These are not based upon inflation and predation, but instead, through experimental gaming, there are these new logics that repatriate Mexica headdress from Austria to reveal the chronotopes of colonial, genocidal, anti-indigenous violence, and also to point to this modern project of racial elimination, which is really a colonial project, as you noted, that of course was the Jewish Holocaust, and prior to that, a very long process of dispossession. What's intriguing to me is the way in which you delve into these artistic practices and then also offer to us this ability to negotiate the relations and show us, expose them between debt, property, privatization, and the nationalist investment in indigenous both incorporation and expulsion. And I thought this was just excellent, the way you showed the dynamism and this complex dynamic that I think, of course, Mexico might, the neoliberal kind of version of Mexico might take the kind of hemispheric prize at accomplishing both incorporation and expulsion at the same time. So yes, I'm convinced another world is possible, another aesthetic is possible through a contra-ontology to the global condition. This is a sense that aesthetic matters, that shows us the heterodox relations of production. You show us distribution and imagination. You show us the creation of vernacular and artistic practice, such as those exceptionally as well with Sandra de la Loza, who places her work within a Chicana borderlands tradition, as well as within a violent yet creative force and history of migration, of labor, and of land occupation. Here, De La Loza's oeuvre makes clear, and you beautifully emphasize this kind of multimedia and performative artistic practice. This, again, is not singular genius, but in relation to the plural, to the many, such as the name Pocho Research Society represents. And that's maybe one question I'd have for you. I notice that you're quite drawn to artists who are able to think of the I within the many, and what that might be as part of your methodology or process of selection of what to emphasize. I've personally had the pleasure of reading this book more than once now, and each time I enjoy it, I learn so much. The book rings especially profound for me in this particular historical conjuncture, a moment where the underbelly of the colonial imperial experiment has been utterly exposed. It's a moment, of course, of tearing down of colonial statues and the outing of billionaire investors whose investments in the carceral state earns them a place on museum boards. This political esprit is not only one of frictions and tears, but I would say a kind of exposure of the collapsing of the model. And I know this sounds hopeful, and it is. I think this book comes out in the emergent and massively urgent relevance of Black Lives Matter, the Red New Deal, anti-extractive activisms, decolonize this place, the need for a global working wage for meaningful work in a moment of international feminisms, of queer of color critique, but also amidst a global health crises, the raging pandemic in the global south, climate injustices and emergencies. The need for critical alternatives to the planetary system is not later, it is now. And this book reminds me about the play, the irony, the satire, the critique, the entire suite of affect and senses that must be put to the service of, and already have been put to the service of, this very project. Let me say, for graduate students or anyone writing a longer work, really, the introduction is magnificent. It carefully stitches together a history of radical ideas, of traditions, of genealogies in the Americas. And these are intellectual histories that show us this complex relationship between aesthetics and politics. You make this look easy, maybe as smooth as butter, as I said to you before, vegan butter maybe. It's actually not easy to do. And I think it can even be seen as contentious work to think about art and art praxis as a site for radical transformative potential. And that's because, of course, the capitalization of art is so intense, especially in the global north. And the aestheticization of social movements sometimes leads to a sense of flattening in the way the terms that social practice come in for. So I just want to say the uniqueness of these deeper engagements that you show us that get really at the root conditions of radical inequality. You're not afraid of this discussion. I appreciate that. And you actually wade in to this complex terrain, and you do so by showing us this composition of our sensorium and how it's shaped by ideology. In the line of Marx, Frantz Fanon, and Sylvia Wynter, you declare the non-separation of the ontological relation of social and biological life. And I think I really appreciated how you both build upon Rancière's important notion of the distribution of the sensible as key, right, to the experience of perception, but you also take issue with the aspects of Rancière that actually evacuate the role of an economic order as central to the social organization of political life. Here you conclude, as you put it, quote, "It is the production of experience in life worlds via material practices that operates within a complex social totality that is overdetermined by the social relation of production," end quote. In other words, you remind us not to detach from the realm of perception, not to detach from the sensorium, to think about these as organizing principles and the set of social relations that ensue, especially, again, during this period that we might define as the new enclosures. So I'll just say a couple more things to close. I think about Another Aesthetics as a compendium book to Veronica Gago's Feminist International. where Gago unites precarious work, anti-extractive politics, the female body and embodiment, and a radical transversal transmedial organizing efforts. Your book, I think, is as important in its radical promise, though it's not explicitly about a politics of unity across heterogeneous forms. Yet it dwells in heterodoxy to think from these rich experimental aesthetics that is the history of the Americas kind of artistic practice. We theorize and dwell in anti-capitalist critique based in material practice. And for me, this is really key that you also think stereoscopically with those artists and methods of those born in the 1960s and 1970s, finding for us a space of extra-institutional and para-disciplinary modes of doing this work outside the gallery. You convince me that another aesthetics is possible, si se puede, and that another world is not only possible, it is already here, aquí, ahora y siempre. So that's the end of my commentary, and thank you so much for your work. Thank you for engaging me. And I would just start with one quick question to kick us off and wonder if there are others, if people want to jump in. But I really appreciated the particular map of the Americas and rebellion that you offered. It's Mexico, it's the US, it's Los Angeles, it's Argentina. And I think it's an excellent way to think about a kind of neoliberal condition and, you know, its precursors. I wonder if you could say a little bit more. Did this kind of happen organically, this map of this kind of Americas rebelde? Did it happen this way? And what the implications of this kind of configuration might have for your particular view on rebellion in this paradigm of war?
Oh, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for those really insightful and very generous comments about the book. And that's a great question about kind of, because I mean, as you said, this is a project that grows out of so many years of research. There's a way that the itinerary of my research is also so interwoven with the itinerary of my life over the course of 2 decades. So as I had mentioned, I initially had decided to go to I did sort of more research, I think, in different places than what ended up in the book, and initially was attracted to Chile and Argentina because I was interested in the really incredible protest art there that, from the 70s and 80s. But it was particularly, I was in Buenos Aires at a time that there was just such a kind of effervescence of, I think in the wake of the uprising and all of the movements there was such effervescence of thinking around these largely autonomous popular movements that really kind of reoriented my research. And also through that, I met a lot of people who I found inspiring and from whom I really learned a great deal. And that was sort of how I ended up doing so much work there on a kind of group of people who in some ways are more like closer to my age and are kind of the children of the generation of the 60s and 70s that I had initially kind of imagined I was going to research. And that was also, part of the kind of my interest in thinking more about this different historical moment and also about the kind of legacy of how do we think about the legacy of the 60s and 70s, but from not in any kind of like nostalgic way, but from thinking about what it might mean to those who are actively engaged in contemporary struggles. So that was kind of what initially happened. It was actually through friends in Buenos Aires that I found out about Eilich's work. And then through, and actually in the case of Sandra de la Loza, I became interested in her work as well as in that of other writers who she collaborates with, from my initial research on the Chicano movement and its legacies. And so that was, and, you know, which I have known her since 2001. And so it was, and I think partly through these different, you know, particular interests, and also just relationships with people, that it, you know, that it ended up being the kind of map of projects that went into this. There was this, I had also initially hoped to write about some collectors in Sao Paulo, but like I said, that's for a later project now. And I think what you asked about, how does that particular geography affect my, you know, my analysis? I think it certainly does. You know, there's, because of the movements I ended up writing about, it would have been very different if I had done this research in Venezuela at the, you know, at this time, or in Bolivia, or for that matter, you know, I mean, it's, or if it is largely based in like metropolitan centers of, and so the questions, and I think in that way, even in the kind of the way, the particular engagement that the book has with, for example, the history of the pink tide, which is more focused on Argentina, is very particular to that being is particular to the contradictions around that project, you know, of Kirchnerism, and which would have been, I think, like I said, it would have been different had I been looking at movements elsewhere. Though, and I think that part of that has to do, you see part of that in the emphasis on autonomous movements, because of where I was writing about, and because of the particular movements I'm writing about. And I guess I'm not, and it's not, sometimes I think there's this impression that because we write about one thing, that means that's like the example that we're holding up as like, this is how, you know, this is the best, this is how things should be, this is the model to follow. And that's not the case for me. I think more I'm trying to do the work of like historicizing these things, well, without saying that I'm writing about them because they are exemplary or they're the model that everybody has to follow. I think in any case, that's not a really useful type of way of thinking about this, you know, actual concrete histories.
Yes, I mean, I think that is an incredibly useful answer, in part because you're following your own kind of practice, and then this kind of set of engagements of, you know, who knows who in relationship to some of this work. And then there's these trans or subnational, international, you know, struggles. And so, you know, the kind of artistic political movements closely follow each other. And I'm thinking as well, the kind of, you know, NAFTA moment in relationship to the peso crisis, in relationship to, you know, the kind of overcapitalization of East Los Angeles in a particular moment. I mean, there's like these routes of capital that actually make a lot of sense for that map as well. And so anyways, I just engage you on that, because I think it's very interesting to think about, you know, NAFTA in relationship to the Argentine peso crisis. And I mean, incredible, right, responses in both cases, and as you track. So that's really wonderful. Mm-hmm.
There was there's a question that came up in the chat here. Should I answer that, or did you want?
Sure, go ahead and why don't you answer that question, and then I have another one for you. Okay.
So this question is about how artists have tried to combat liberal co-optation or aestheticization of their work. And yeah, I did see some really interesting examples of that. One example that I actually don't write about in the book, but it got cut at some point, but it was an intervention I really appreciated, was I had mentioned before that the kind of Nestor Kirchner's government really adopted the kind of discourse of the human rights. And the kind of cultural institutions played a large part in kind of this alignment between the government and this discourse of what had been, largely a grassroots and more autonomous movement. And so there was, I think in 2006, artists were invited to participate in an exhibition about the memories of the dictatorship, and at a major state cultural center. And GAC and Etc. were invited, and they did this really interesting intervention which I think they did right before the show opened to avoid kind of curatorial oversight on it. And they made this huge sign that said, "What is the government doing about human rights violations today?" And then included all of this, these documents that had been gathered by this really interesting organization called Correpi that's a really radical human rights organization that really focuses on police violence, but on since the dictatorship, in the present, and put together all of this documentation on the killings of people by the police, as well as the kind of geographic locations where that happens, which really shows the concentration is in working class areas. And so this was for a really pointed kind of contestation of the way that artists were being invited into sort of a commemoration of the dictatorship that in many ways was participating in what I talk about in the book as a kind of periodization of state violence that works to kind of cast, cordon off the question of state violence to this period of dictatorship and naturalize the routinized violence of the liberal state. And so these artists sort of use this opportunity of the invitation to participate in this as a way to instead use that as a platform to, raise this, raise the question of ongoing state violence, but also raise the question of, what was going on in the kind of use of culture to kind of promote this certain periodizing logic that focuses our questions about state violence just on the past. I think that was one really interesting example of that. I think that there's, Eilich also had a kind of, in my interviews with him, talked about ways that he wanted to kind of prevent the idea that there would be this, this is I think an interesting example. He circulated this petition about repatriating this headdress, and then that was addressed to the presidents of the Austrian and Mexican republics, and this petition was a big part of this artwork. And then later he just said that he was going to discard the petition because he doesn't believe in petitions. And so and what it ended up actually doing is kind of juxtaposing in an interesting way the kind of a politics of supplication, or of kind of and also a kind of politics that was more concerned in sort of representation within a kind of symbolic realm, and juxtaposed to that in a really explicit way a kind of material practice of solidarity with living indigenous communities. So there is a way that there is a kind of actually actively plays with kind of deception and the inviting certain readings of his work, only to then actually critique those readings and juxtapose to them, to a more symbolic representational politics, a much more kind of material politics of solidarity.
Yeah, I mean, Jennifer, what you're saying is so important there, and I just want to kind of think about another example with Sebastian's question, and then maybe ask you about that. I mean, I think this question of, co-optation is always foremost on our mind in relationship to radical struggles and art, politics, and etc. I also wonder to the extent that which sometimes artists suffer so much for their radical politics that they are in the realm of kind of hyper invisibility sometimes. So I think of like Lotti Rosenfeld in relationship to Gara in a Chilean context where, even though there were these really impactful anti-authoritarian strategies of, using crosses or somehow scarring the landscape in the urban in Santiago to really show the kind of militarized practices of the dictatorship. And then later, Lotti continued a kind of really rich, artistic practice until she actually passed away not very long ago. She was never recognized by, Chile or the, any apparatus of, the cultural ministry, or never received these really important prizes despite having innovated on every level of kind of form and politics. So I think that we sometimes forget that's the other side, of this, the kind of incorporative move by the state is a kind of absolute negation. And I wondered if you had examples of that or what you thought of that kind of statement.
Yeah, that's a great question because, I write, I think I make a big effort in the book to talk about and historicize extra institutional practices, right, that take place in the streets, or by emailing or what have you. But I don't want to, aside those questions of like people of artistic labor and the question that people have to, sometimes there's both questions of visibility and the fact that, institutions help create publics for people's work. And they also help pay people or make it possible for people to live from doing their work. And one of the things I've been interested in, and it's one of the reasons why I interview artists and I'm so interested in learning about their production, is also just figuring out how people, organize all of it, including the economic aspect of it, including their own social reproduction and how they're going to survive and have these projects, because that's kind of part of the strategy as well, right? There's, and people come up with all kinds of ways to do that. And sometimes that might mean having like a commercial practice and an activist practice that are separate, or having an art practice that is, that they don't have those concerns with about having to make money from, and then have an other job that they can, because none of the people I write about are like independently wealthy. So this is a question everybody has to address. And then I think also for the question of visibility, that's a big one, because, and I think that people have, and I've been trying to think through a kind of taxonomy of different ways of thinking of these type of practices, because I think there are some that operate sort of like Trojan horses within institutional spaces, like this example of Eilich's project, which is commissioned by Art Festival, and, makes it possible for him to buy 100 kilos of Zapatista coffee and do this pop-up coffee shop that has this kind of solidarity practice. But then there's also practices, artists and collectives that I write about who, organize other publics for their work, because they're not circulating it in these institutional spaces. And that is sometimes by, those publics might be activist publics that are part of the movements that, in which they're circulating their work. They might be, in the case of Eilich, he kind of creates a public like through email spamming in some cases. And this is also why I emphasize this, as you noted, the attention to the relations of production and distribution, and that this is also something that these artists are working on. And so many of them, actually, I think all of them, have at some point created alternate cultural infrastructure, whether that was squatted cultural, spaces that they turned into theaters. In the case of Etc., Fran had a media lab in his garage and created a radio show and a newspaper. And Sandra de la Loza was involved in all kinds of collective, independent art spaces and projects. There's even the self-publishing, I think, is an example of this. So I also think I really think that that's such an important contribution, is also this creation of these alternate platforms. I mean, just of course, like why I care so much about independent presses and publishers and these spaces, and that provides us does such important work. And I think also as to what you were saying about artists who think of the I and the we, that work also sometimes might just be creating the creative work of creating platforms and spaces for these circulation itself is such an enormous creative contribution, right? That doesn't operate according to the logic of, the art star in any way. It's actually quite the inverse of that.
No, that's great. I think just really, really important points that you're making there about this kind of production of the very social systems, that are creating this alternative world. So thank you for that. There is another question in the chat that notices the conversation, but wants to hear more about why you chose the term rebellion and how maybe that term is in dialogue with other terms such as liberation, decolonization, resistance, revolution, and so forth. So thank you, JM, for that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that in some ways, I chose it because it is, I think that it's broader and can kind of encompass the various politics that are, that the practices that I write about entail. And because the movements, that I live, all the artists that I'm writing about are leftists, but also of different type of ideological tendencies, ranging from, Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, Zapatista, anarchist, Trotskyist, probably some more social democrat. But the movements are also quite diverse. And so in that case, I wouldn't call them all revolutionary movements. And that's kind of one of the issues, deal very directly with the kind of contradictions of the human rights movement, for example, as having important relationships to a revolutionary history, but at the same time also having these kind of elements of a kind of, of being a predominantly liberal framework for dealing with state violence. So there's a way that, and I think that, Zapatismo has kind of redefined what revolutionary praxis might be in ways that are quite different from, obviously like Leninist traditions or something like that. So there's and in the case of the displacement struggles, I think that's more of a type of resistance and a popular resistance that is not necessarily revolutionary. In some cases has a kind of anti-colonial politics, in others not. So I think it kind of depends on each instance. I am very invested in the particularly in the anti-colonial aspects of some of these movements. And so that is a key, I think a key aspect that comes through in the, particularly in my writing on Zapatismo and on Eilich's work. But again, that's, I think it's something that is best understood thinking more about the particular cases than kind of generalizing across them, just because they are quite different.
Yes, and I think, the idea, it's not that you offer a kind of, unifying principle, as it were, to unite workers across many kinds of struggles. But rebellion becomes, I think, this category that's really supple in your work. And it does a lot of work to think about both resistance, as well as refusal, as well as collectivities that are doing particular kind of striking actions, the improvisational quality that sometimes occurs, such as you noted, in some of the work that you presented, or the I for the we. So rebellion, I think, for me, I really appreciated that category because it's quite capacious and allows us to think with the heterodoxy within kind of political left. And you don't necessarily find that, it's not orthodoxy. You're not interested in orthodoxies. You're actually interested in heterodoxies. So I wondered if you ever felt tension around that in relationship to either the groups that you study or the political communities that you're a part of, because sometimes there's an either or provocation,
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And yeah, I think, and it's not that I have felt, I think, tension on an interpersonal level with individuals, but certainly kind of, nervousness or realizing that, these were very active, ongoing debates, and sometimes, conflicts, ideological conflicts. Like, for example, the issue I think that felt the most salient in writing about the case of Argentina and Kirchnerism, because some of the artists I write have been much more aligned with Kirchnerism, as distinct from, say, Etcetera's work, who've been very critical of it, and that was an enormous type of divide within among leftists, among the movements, to the point of people like not being welcome in certain organizations depending on their alignment with or against. And this is Kirchnerism, and this is one of these cases where you have I was very where you have a kind of right-wing critique of a kind of more progressive but still capitalist project, that then the accusation that left-wing critiques of that are somehow helping the right. Mm-hmm. This was the kind of there was a lot of that in the kind of divisions around writing about Kirchnerism. And so that was something where, I made clear, like, I know the difference between a neoliberal authoritarian and, and that's not what I'm advocating for, but I still think that the anti-capitalist critique was an absolutely necessary one to make, even though it wasn't welcome in certain contexts, and I do think that there's certain divisions around between like more anarchist and Marxist thinking, which I think in my mind are really important debates, and ones that are certainly, ones that we have to ask when talking, thinking about autonomous movements. Correct. And also when, and so those to me are, I don't think that I resolve any of those debates in the book. I try to just, and I felt kind of beyond the scope of what I was doing to do that. And also because in some ways, these are, some of these questions are ones that are not, I don't think can kind of be answered from just a theoretical kind of declaration. Like, it really is much more, like even in the case of the Zapatistas, like the way that their praxis has changed from national revolutionary project to a more autonomous project. Even within this, there's such complexity even within one of these movements that I was more interested in showing that complexity and that history, and showing the kind of stakes of some of these debates without, trying to carry the flag of one or another position.
Yes. I mean, I think you're really getting into very complex and rich ground here, and I really appreciate your discussion. I mean, I think, these questions are so enlivened in the Americas in such powerful ways, and I think about the debates either from the U.S. or even from within the Latin America, say on the pink tide, and what it means to kind of capture the position of governance, and then what it means for art collectives to respond to that. And I know in my own work I've written on indigenous anarchist feminisms and how that creates a really complex kind of practice of negotiation, mediation, critique, etc. And I mean, I could see your work kind of really moving in it's not easy to piece all of that together, really. And you did it really well, to think more complexly about aesthetics. But I would ask you if you see a difference, I mean, of theorizing from, and I hate to make the distinction now, but from Latin America versus from the United States, right? Because you have those both locations. And part of it is, I wonder, did the kind of art market in the United States feel, historically feel maybe more rapacious, or some of those 60s and 70s counter movements, say ASCO, out of kind of Chicano East LA, and, some of the incorporative logics, or the more that, and potentially in Latin America, I mean, one kind of binary could be that, in Latin America, there's these much longer traditions of histories, of art histories engaged with kind of political left. But that doesn't hold up well, right? And I think in your research, what you're trying to do is show it depends on the lens. It depends on how you see the racial state. It depends on the anti-colonial formation. It depends on local struggle. I just wondered if you could just get into the texture of that a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, initially in the course of my research, it did feel very different to be doing this research and kind of in conversation with people in Mexico or Argentina or Chile than it felt like to be in the US. And I think part of that has to do with they also, and I say being in the US, it also, I was in academic settings, and there was a way that in the US, and there was a way that being in South America or in Mexico, there were these kind of, Marxist and anarchist thought was just much more accessible and among intellectuals than it was in the US. I think like anti-communism in the US has really profoundly shaped kind of intellectual life, particularly within institutions. And so that was a big difference. And it, and I think also, as you said, the kind of, the sort of long tradition and sort of maybe a greater acceptance of leftist art there that made it easier to talk about art as participating in that tradition, rather than it kind of immediately being read as, within, say, in relationship to the genre of social practice art within the US, right? Which is, I think, a good example of a certain way that, that has been professionalized and entered into these kind of fine arts realms. So that I thought was a difference. I think also a difference in relating to the legacy of, initially it felt the difference of kind of the legacy of the 60s and 70s, because, and how that, younger artists and activists were grappling with that. And I think part of that is because it was clearly a revolutionary history that, and that people were thinking about when they're writing, when they were in Mexico or in Argentina or Chile. And so talking about that earlier generation, or even talking about their parents, they're talking about revolutionary struggle, like explicitly anti-capitalist revolutionary struggle. And many, and many people are children of communist militants, and that's just, whereas in the US, and this has to partly do with the kind of own trajectory of my research, when talking about the 60s and 70s, what I felt was often being talked about was actually a kind of revisionist history of liberation movements in the US that had kind of cast these as being like ethno-nationalist movements, which was a really particular like pet peeve of mine that I kind of mentioned in my talk, that there's been such a overriding of radical politics within the US in the way that, and a really concerted, and I think in many ways very successful kind of neutralization of those radical histories by kind of overriding them into this kind of history of racial liberalism, right? And though I have to say that as you mentioned, those distinctions do sort of break down when you, from a different perspective, like this idea that neoliberalism, I mean, on one hand, I do think it's very true that, the history of neoliberalization in South America is this history of military dictatorship and state terrorism and, political genocide. And we often think about in the like global North that it's kind of was imposed more through these hegemonic, mechanisms. But then there's also, Ward Churchill has this, in one of his essays, he compares the number of people of the Chilean left, the percentage of people of the Chilean left who were killed, to the percentage of people in the American Indian movement who were killed or imprisoned, and says like, this is actually comparable if you look at it this way.
Yes.
And we oftentimes don't talk about the state violence that, the US state used, obviously not only against radical movements all over, the third world, but also against radicals within the US. And so there's a way that sometimes I think those differences that I initially saw also had to do in many ways with my own education and being kind of so immersed in the dominant histories that I had, learned about how the US state deals with its own people, right? That actually upon closer examination, it really depends on what people you're talking about, in the US. And so that I think certainly was a really instructive, something I learned a lot from in doing that kind of transnational historicization, right? On actually trying to break down the paradigms that I had already kind of come with in thinking about US history as opposed to Latin American history.
I think that's such a powerful response. I mean, about this kind of counterinsurgency against, communities of color and militancy, in the US, Black Panthers, AIM, as you said, et cetera. And very, very powerful and really important period work that you do in the 60s and 70s, and then the later turn after the neoliberalism. So thank you. Thank you for such a wonderful, enlivened conversation, for a beautiful presentation for this extraordinary book, Another Aesthetics is Possible. So happy that this is out. And of course, you can get it again from Common Notions. And I don't know if Malaf, if you're going to send us off into the ether. But thank you, Jennifer. I don't know if you had final words.
No, I just want to thank you so much. This was such an interesting conversation, and I always learn so much from you. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thank you, everyone, for attending this, and have a great night. Thanks again.